They said I embarrassed the family. But how would you feel if your own parents skipped your wedding for your sister's beach trip, then sent you a check that read, "Maybe now you'll learn the value of family"? I didn't cash it. I didn't call. 2 weeks later, as their friends whispered about the ungrateful daughter, my wedding photos from Hawaii hit every local paper. They saw what they missed: the ocean, the laughter, the freedom. That was my quiet revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The late afternoon sun spilled through the white curtains of my mother's old house in Santa Monica, soft and golden, the kind of light that made everything look peaceful even when it wasn't. The faint scent of Earl Grey and Chanel No. 5 hung in the air. Two things that always reminded me of her. Mom's voice echoed from the hallway as she directed the housekeeper to polish the silverware for the Heritage Society luncheon that evening. Every move she made was practiced, controlled, like her life was one long performance for the world to see. I sat on the cream sofa, a folder of wedding notes balanced on my knees. Across the room, the walls were lined with framed photographs, vacations in Aspen, charity galas. Maddie's graduation, Maddie at the beach, Maddie cutting her birthday cake. Not one picture of me. I used to tell myself it didn't matter that I wasn't the kind of daughter who needed to be on display, but that lie had worn thin years ago. She stepped into the living room, pearl earrings gleaming, her hair perfectly pinned back. "You'll never believe the turnout for next week's summer gala," she said, half smiling, as she adjusted a vase of roses. "Tradition keeps people together, you know. It gives the Whitmores their name." I cleared my throat. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice even. "Jason and I set a date for the wedding. August 24th. Her hands stilled over the flowers. She turned, smile frozen in place. "August," she repeated. "Sweetheart, that's the week Maddie's taking her annual retreat with the girls. You remember that, don't you?" "I remember," I said softly, "but August 24th is the day Jason and I met. It's important to us." She tilted her head, still smiling, but the warmth drained from her face. "You're really going to make this difficult, aren't you?" "I'm not trying to make anything difficult," I said. "It's one weekend. Maddie's trip can be rescheduled. She let out a sharp laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. "You think the world revolves around you. You've always been that way, self-centered, ungrateful. Family traditions matter more than your wedding. Do you understand that?" Her words sliced through me. I had heard them in different forms all my life, but this time something shifted inside me. I looked at her, really looked at her. The flawless posture, the immaculate suit, the way she clung to control as if it could stop time. Then, "Enjoy your trip," I said quietly. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in offense, like I'd broken a sacred rule. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Neither of us moved. From the hallway, the old grandfather clock chimed, once its slow, heavy tick filling the silence. I stood, the folder slipping from my lap and landing softly on the carpet. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed calm. "I'm not asking for permission, Mom. I just wanted you to know." She said nothing, only turned back to the vase, rearranging the roses again, as if that conversation had never happened. I walked through the French doors and out onto the balcony. The ocean breeze carried the faint sound of traffic mixed with the distant hum of waves. Santa Monica had that way of pretending serenity. Sunshine, ocean air, polished smiles, but underneath everything cracked like porcelain. From where I stood, I could see the palm trees swaying along Ocean Avenue, the sky painted in orange and lilac. For a moment, I wondered what it would be like to belong somewhere where I didn't have to earn approval just to breathe. Behind me, I heard the soft clink of china, and my mother's voice calling to the maid, already back to preparing for her next event. It was as if my words had evaporated before they reached her. I closed my eyes. The smell of the sea reached me faintly, and I let the wind brush against my face. That was the moment I realized I would never fit inside the frame she built for me. The version of daughterhood she wanted, quiet and compliant, always secondary to Maddie, always measured against a tradition that had nothing to do with love. I took one last look at the house, its white shutters gleaming against the sunset, and whispered to myself, "Then enjoy your trip." The clock inside struck again, and I turned toward the sound of the ocean, walking away from the balcony door. The breeze carried the faintest echo of her voice, but I didn't stop to listen. Dinner at my parents' house always looked perfect from the outside. Crystal chandelier, glowing linen napkins folded like swans, the faint smell of roasted rosemary chicken filling the room. But perfect had its own kind of chill. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, and yet no one at that table really looked at anyone else. Mom sat at the head pearls catching the light as she talked to Dean about the upcoming charity auction. "We're aiming for a record this year," she said, her tone bright and deliberate. "The Heritage Society expects results, and I refuse to let this family be anything less than exemplary." Dean nodded, the obedient eldest. "You always make it happen, Mom." I sat halfway down the table, Jason next to me, quietly unfolding his napkin. The empty seat beside Dad was filled with an iPad. Maddie's face beamed from the screen, her background showing some glossy resort in Tulum. "Hi, family," she chirped through the speaker. "You guys are missing out. Look at this place." She flipped her camera to show turquoise water champagne glasses clinking in the background. Mom's face softened immediately. "Oh, Maddie, that looks wonderful." "You must be exhausted after your travel day." Maddie grinned. "Barely Brian upgraded us to a suite with a private pool. Perks of dating someone who actually plans ahead." Her words floated like tiny knives, polished and smiling. I tried not to react. Jason's hand brushed against my knee under the table, a small grounding touch. Dad carved the chicken with quiet precision. The only sound was the scrape of the carving knife, and the hum of Maddie's voice echoing from the tablet. I watched the way he focused on the roast, not the people around it. He'd mastered the art of absence while being present. When the plates were passed around, I took a breath. So I began forcing a smile. "I got some news today. Pacific Horizon just promoted me to project manager for their coastal expansion." Jason looked at me with pride. "She's been leading the Hawaii proposal. Her work's been getting a lot of attention." Dean smiled. "That's great, Grace. Congratulations." Mom finally glanced at me, her lips tightening in what might have been a smile. "Well, at least you're doing something stable," she said. "Your last job barely lasted a year." My stomach tightened. That was a contract position. This one's long-term. "Good," she said shortly, turning back to Dean. "You know the auction will need someone to manage guest check-in. Maybe Maddie could coordinate. She's so personable." "Of course she is," Maddie said through the screen hair perfectly curled. "And speaking of coordination, Mom, remember that retreat I mentioned? We booked the villa for late August. You and Dad should come by before we fly out." I felt the room tilt slightly. Jason looked at me, knowing what was coming. Mom turned to me, still smiling. "That's the same weekend you mentioned earlier, isn't it?" "Dear, for your wedding?" I nodded. "Yes, August 24th. We're keeping it small. Close friends, some coworkers." Silence stretched. The only sound was Maddie's laughter through the speaker. "Maybe you could move it, Gracie. That's like right during my annual trip. It's kind of tradition." I forced my tone calm. Traditions can change. Mom's fork clinked against her plate. "Not in this family." Jason tried to lighten the mood. "We just wanted everyone to be there. It would mean a lot." Dean gave me a sympathetic look, but said nothing. Dad cleared his throat quietly. "It's a busy time of year, sweetheart. You might want to consider another date." I looked from one face to another, their calm expressions polite and distant. They weren't cruel. They were just indifferent. That somehow hurt more. "I'm not changing it," I said softly. Mom set down her glass. "You don't need to get defensive. We're simply stating what's reasonable." "Reasonable," I repeated. "Got it." On the tablet, Maddie tilted her head, eyes shining with mock pity. "I mean, don't take it personally, Gracie. Some people just have plans that can't be moved." Jason's voice cut through, low but steady. "We'll make it work no matter who shows up." Mom exhaled sharply, waving her hand as if brushing away a nuisance. "Well, let's not ruin dinner over this." The rest of the meal passed in fragmented chatter. Dean talking about work, Maddie gossiping about someone from college, Mom laughing too loudly. I sat there tasting nothing, watching the candlelight flicker across their faces. When dessert was served, I excused myself saying I needed fresh air. Jason offered to come with me, but I shook my head. I stepped out through the sliding doors to the back patio. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of salt. From here, the ocean was just a dark outline against the sky. Inside, I could still hear their voices. Maddie's bright mom's composed Dad's low hum of agreement. None of them noticed I was gone. I leaned against the railing, staring at the streetlights beyond the garden, little pools of gold in the distance. The wind brushed my hair, and I closed my eyes. They didn't have to say it outright. The message had been the same for years, wrapped in politeness and expectations. I was always the one on the outside, the extra piece that didn't quite fit. And that, too, had become a family tradition. The conference room at the Santa Monica Heritage Society looked like something out of a glossy magazine. White orchids in crystal vases, gold-trimmed notepads, and the faint scent of lemon polish. My mother stood at the center of it all, dressed in a navy suit, pearls resting perfectly on her collarbone. The picture of composure. I watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping back into the hall. I wasn't supposed to be there. She'd made that clear. But I'd come early to drop off a donation envelope for the local children's program, one she'd once told me I was too busy to contribute to. Through the crack in the door, her voice rang out smooth and confident. "The Whitmore family has always valued tradition," she said, tapping her pen against the podium. "We don't follow trends, we set standards." The women around her nodded approvingly, some jotting notes. I felt an old familiar sting in my chest. She could turn anything into a speech about legacy. Fundraisers, holidays, now even her daughter's wedding. Then a woman at the far end of the table raised her hand. I recognized her as Claire Donovan, a local reporter who covered society events. "Evelyn," she said lightly. "I heard your eldest daughter's getting married soon. I didn't see it on the club's announcement list. Are we not invited to celebrate the next generation of Whitmores?" For the first time, my mother hesitated. She smiled, small and tight. "Grace has her own ideas," she said. "We respect her choices, within reason." A few polite laughs rippled through the room, but I saw it. The flicker in her expression, the quick adjustment of her pearl necklace. Control was slipping. I walked away before the meeting ended. By the time I got home that evening, her car was already in the driveway. The front door slammed open a minute after I parked. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor, the sound that had always meant trouble. She dropped her designer handbag onto the entry table, scattering envelopes. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. I froze halfway through taking off my coat. "What are you talking about?" "That woman from the Chronicle ambushed me today because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about your wedding. I haven't spoken to any reporters, Mom." "Then how do they know? Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to stand there and be questioned about my own family as if I've lost control?" Her voice cracked slightly at the last word. Control. That was what this had always been about. Not love, not family. Control. I took a step closer. "You're overreacting. It's a wedding, not a scandal." Her eyes narrowed. "Everything becomes a scandal when people like us behave beneath our name. I didn't realize getting married was beneath the Whitmore name." She turned away, one hand pressed to her forehead. "You always twist everything I say." I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice steady. "No. I just finally stopped pretending it made sense." Her hand dropped to her side. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavy with all the things we'd never said. She looked at me for a long moment as if she were searching for the girl who used to apologize. Then she walked past me and up the stairs without another word. A few seconds later, I heard her door slam. The next morning, I buried myself in work. Pacific Horizon Hotels was headquartered in downtown Los Angeles, 20 floors up, overlooking the Pacific. The ocean stretched out beyond the glass, impossibly calm, as if it belonged to someone else's world. Grace, my boss. Helen Park called from her office doorway. She was the kind of leader who could make anyone stop talking just by entering the room. "Do you have a minute?" I followed her inside. The office smelled faintly of coffee and fresh orchids. "I read your latest proposal." "For the coastal expansion," she said. "The Hawaii property is reopening next spring, and I want you to manage it. You'll oversee the event portfolio, including private bookings." It took me a second to process. "You mean anything?" "Even personal events." She smiled. "If it fits the brand, yes. It could be a great opportunity for visibility. Honestly, I think you'd handle it beautifully." I hesitated. "Helen, could I host my own wedding there?" Her eyebrows lifted. "You and Jason?" I nodded. We wanted something simple, but meaningful. "Well," she said, leaning back with a grin. "What better way to showcase the resort than with one of our own leading the event?" "Consider it approved. Just promise me it won't end up in one of those family drama columns." I laughed softly. No guarantees. When I told Jason that evening, he smiled in that easy, open way of his. We were sitting in our apartment in Venice, the window cracked to let in the ocean breeze. "You're serious," he said. "You're getting married in Hawaii." "That's perfect. It feels right," I said. "Like something that's ours." He brushed a strand of hair from my face. "Your mom's going to hate it, I know." He hesitated, searching my face. "You sure you're ready for that fight?" "It's not a fight," I said quietly. "It's just me choosing not to surrender anymore." He nodded, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber. I stood by the window, looking at the distant shimmer of water, thinking about my mother's voice in that conference room, so proud, so sure that tradition was the glue holding everything together. Maybe she was right, but sometimes glue holds even the wrong things in place. If she saw me as the one who broke tradition, then maybe breaking it was exactly what I needed to do. If she looked down on what I built, I'd let her see it anyway. I'd let her see every piece of the life she decided wasn't worth her approval. And maybe for once, I'd let her feel what it was like to lose control. The ballroom at the Ocean Crest Hotel shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers. A jazz trio played in the corner, the steady rhythm of the bass blending with the chatter of Santa Monica's old money crowd. My mother thrived in places like this. These were her people, donors, board members, and society wives, who measured worth in reputation, and whose smiles were as polished as their jewelry. I watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping aside unnoticed. Mom stood near the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, her laugh light but deliberate. She was in her element. Every gesture, every word rehearsed to perfection. My father Charles hovered nearby, shaking hands with Nathan Briggs, one of his old law firm partners. Nathan's tone carried just enough volume to cut through the hum of conversation. "Evelyn, I heard your daughter's wedding falls the same weekend as Madison's beach retreat. That must be awkward." Mom's hand tightened on her glass. For half a second, her smile faltered. Then she recovered her voice smooth. "Oh, that's just a misunderstanding. We're a close family. Everything's perfectly fine." Nathan nodded, but the smirk on his face lingered a little too long. As the night went on, I could almost feel the whispers trailing her like perfume. I heard my name once, then twice, spoken in low, amused tones. "Such a shame," someone murmured behind me. She was always the quiet one. When the band switched to a slower tune, Mom finally caught my eye from across the room. Her expression didn't change, but I knew what it meant. Leave. I slipped out into the cool night before the event ended. From the valet line, I watched her through the glass doors, still smiling, still pretending. She got home an hour later. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I was sitting on the sofa, still in my work clothes, half expecting this. She tossed her clutch onto the coffee table. "Do you enjoy making a fool of me?" I stayed seated. "What happened?" "What happened?" She laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. "Everyone in that room was talking about you. About your wedding. About how you're splitting the family in two. You've made me a headline before I've even finished my speech season. I didn't realize your speeches were more important than my wedding," I said quietly. "Don't twist my words, Grace. You know how this looks. People think I've lost control of my own daughter. Maybe they see that you care more about what people think than about me being happy." Her face flushed color rising high on her cheekbones. "You have no idea what it takes to maintain a name like ours. You think independence is some virtue? It's arrogance. You're still part of this family whether you like it or not in any way that matters," I said. The silence that followed was thick. Her breathing was sharp, uneven. For a second, she looked smaller, older. Then the wall went back up. She turned away, heels striking the marble floor. "You'll regret the way you speak to me." Maybe I said standing, but at least they'll be my words, not yours. She didn't answer. The sound of her door slamming upstairs was the same one I remembered from my teenage years. Later that night, my phone buzzed. Dean's name lit up the screen. "Grace," he said, sighing into the receiver. "Mom's upset. You need to ease up. I didn't start this. I know, but she won't stop until you do. You can't win with her. I'm not trying to win Dean. I just don't want to keep losing myself." He was quiet for a moment. "She's still our mom." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room, the city lights casting faint reflections on the glass doors. Jason came in from the kitchen, drying his hands with a towel. "I could hear her from outside," he said gently. "She thinks I embarrassed her." He came to sit beside me, You didn't. You just drew a line and she's not used to lines. I leaned my head against his shoulder. I wish I didn't care so much. You care because you're human, he said, not because you owe her something. We sat there for a long time listening to the muffled crash of waves in the distance. The air smelled faintly of salt and roses, her perfume lingering from earlier. In the silence, I felt something loosen in my chest, a quiet kind of acceptance. I didn't need to fight anymore. I just needed to stop bowing. By the next morning, word had spread further. A small column in the local society section ran a single line. Sources suggest a rift in the Whitmore household over an unapproved wedding date. Some reporter had scribbled a note in her pad the night before, probably as she watched my mother smile through clenched teeth. Whitmore family drama, it read at the top of the page. It was almost poetic. The story she'd spent her whole life editing was finally being written without her permission. The light in Honolulu had a different kind of honesty. Sharp, clean, and almost too bright to hide behind. The ocean outside the Pacific Horizon Resort looked endless, its surface glinting like glass under the late morning sun. I could smell the salt, the plumeria blossoms, the faint trace of sunscreen carried by the wind. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Helen walked ahead of us, her clipboard tucked under one arm, as she pointed out the ceremony lawn near the cliffs. "This is where we usually host VIP weddings," she said. "Sunset hits the horizon, right about there. Gold hour, perfect lighting. If you're lucky, you might even get dolphins in the backdrop." Jason grinned, squinting at the view. "You're kidding. Dolphins?" Helen laughed. "Nope. Happens all the time. You just can't schedule them in the budget." He turned to me, eyes bright. "Babe, this is it. This is the beginning we wanted." I smiled, the kind of smile that hurts in your throat. I could see it all in my mind. The white chairs lined up on the grass, the sound of soft music blending with the tide, the faces of my friends and co-workers, people who actually showed up because they wanted to. Not because it made them look good. No empty rows reserved for people who decided I wasn't worth rearranging a calendar for. Helen stopped beside us, shading her eyes. "You know, Grace, if you want to host your wedding here, we can fold it into our marketing campaign, call it a brand story. Pacific Horizon celebrates love and leadership. We'd cover most of the cost. It'd be good PR for the company, and frankly, good for you." I blinked. "You're serious?" "Completely," she said. "Consider it my thank you for the last 12 months of work you pulled off. You've earned this." For a second, I couldn't answer. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation, something my own family had never been able to give. I finally said, "Thank you, Helen. That means more than you know." Jason leaned close and whispered, "See, even the ocean's on your side." That night, back in our hotel room, overlooking the beach, I wrote the invitation list. It was shorter than I expected. I sent emails to colleagues and friends, a few old college roommates, and reluctantly one to my family. I knew how it would go, but I needed to send it anyway. The next morning I woke to my phone buzzing. A text from Maddie lit up the screen. "Already booked my Tulum trip," she wrote. "Sorry, sis. Timing's bad. Have fun, though." A minute later, Dean's name appeared. I read his message twice. "I'll try, but Mom's furious. She says you're humiliating her." Then a third text, shorter, from Dad. "Proud of you. Wishing you happiness." That one made me stop. It wasn't much, but for my father it was a confession. When I told Jason, he squeezed my hand. "He'll come around," he said softly. "I'm not sure he ever left," I said. We spent the afternoon meeting with the resort's event manager, tasting food, picking flowers. Helen joined us briefly, her phone buzzing every few minutes. "Grace, the board signed off," she said. "You're officially our test case for the relaunch campaign." I laughed. "You make it sound like I'm an experiment." "Maybe you are," she said, smiling. "A successful one." Later that evening, the sky turned violet, and the hotel lights flickered to life. Jason and I walked barefoot along the shore, letting the waves pull at our feet. "Do you think your mom will ever forgive you?" he asked. "She doesn't see it as something to forgive," I said. "To her, it's rebellion, and to you, it's just choosing myself. For once." We walked in silence for a while, listening to the ocean. Somewhere in the distance, someone played a ukulele, a soft melody floating through the air. When we got back to our room, there was a voicemail from Aunt Lorraine. Her voice was warm, steady as ever. "Sweetheart, I got your invitation," she said. "And yes, I'll be there. I'm not choosing sides. I'm just showing up for love. And you deserve to be loved. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I sat on the bed, holding the phone against my chest. Jason brushed my shoulder. "She sounds like someone who actually gets it." "She always has," I said, even when no one else did. The next few days blurred into work and planning. Emails, calls, dress fittings, travel schedules. The more details we finalized, the more I realized how little my family's absence mattered to the shape of the day. What once felt like a hole was becoming a space filled with peace. Still, the night before we flew back to Los Angeles, I drove alone through the quiet streets of my parents' neighborhood. The house was dark except for the porch light still glowing like it always had. I let myself in with the spare key from my old set. The air inside smelled the same, lemon polish and something floral. The living room hadn't changed. Every wall still displayed Maddie's smiling face at different stages of her life. I ran my fingers over one of the frames, her graduation photo. Mom's hand on her shoulder. Both of them looking perfect. No trace of me anywhere. In the silence, I could almost hear Mom's voice echoing from years ago. "This family has order, Grace. We don't disrupt it." I stood there for a long moment, letting the words settle, then set the frame back on the shelf. When I walked out, the wind caught my hair warm and soft. For the first time, I realized freedom didn't always come with applause or recognition. Sometimes it was just the quiet decision to walk forward, even when no one followed. I locked the door behind me and looked up at the windows still dark. Tomorrow, I thought I'd stop asking them to see me. The morning of the wedding felt like it belonged to another world. The air in Honolulu was warm but gentle, carrying the smell of salt and plumeria blossoms. From my hotel balcony, I could see the ceremony lawn below, already lined with white ribbons that danced with every breeze. The ocean stretched beyond it, blue and endless sunlight scattering across the water like shards of glass. I stood there for a while, barefoot, the hem of my robe brushing against my legs, listening to the faint hum of music as the staff did final checks. From a distance, I could hear laughter, the kind that was genuine, unforced. Not the brittle kind that filled my parents' dining room back home. Helen knocked once, before entering clipboard in hand and a headset around her neck. "You ready to make history?" she teased. I smiled. "Just trying to make it down the aisle without tripping." "You'll be fine," she said. "The team's got everything under control. Even the weather seems to be cooperating." Behind her, I saw her staff moving like clockwork, adjusting the floral arch, testing microphones, polishing glass lanterns. To them, this was a project. To me, it was a beginning. When the time came, Aunt Lorraine came in holding my bouquet, white peonies with a few sprigs of lavender. Her eyes shimmered. "You look just like your father's mother did at her wedding," she said softly. I turned toward her. "You really think so?" She nodded. She had that same calm about her, like she already knew she didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. I laughed quietly, careful not to smudge my lipstick. "Guess it runs in the family, then." Downstairs, the guests began to gather. Most were friends, colleagues. A few of Jason's old bandmates from college, who were tuning guitars off to the side. Everyone wore light colors. Linen pastels, the kind of palette that made everything look soft and effortless. When I finally stepped out toward the beach, the music changed. My heart thudded in my chest. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the ocean breeze brushing against my veil. Jason was waiting at the altar barefoot, smiling so wide I almost laughed. Behind him, the horizon glowed gold. Helen stood near the back, hands clasped, watching like a proud stage manager. Aunt Lorraine was beside me, clutching the bouquet so tight her knuckles turned white. When the minister nodded for me to begin walking, she leaned close and whispered, "You've already won, sweetheart." Each step toward Jason felt lighter than the last. When I reached him, he took my hands, his thumb brushing against my skin like a promise. The world around us blurred, the waves, the colors, the people. And for the first time in years, I felt completely seen. Jason began his vows first. His voice was steady low. "Grace, you taught me that love isn't about being chosen. It's about choosing. Every day, I choose you. No conditions, no expectations, just us." By the time it was my turn, my throat tightened. "You once asked me what I wanted most," I said. "I told you peace. But the truth is, I didn't know what peace was until I met you." The minister smiled. "You may kiss the bride." As he leaned in, the ocean breeze lifted my veil. The applause that followed sounded like waves. Later, as the sun dipped into the water, the reception lights came on. The sky glowed pink and amber, and the smell of grilled pineapple and champagne filled the air. Guests clinked glasses, laughed, danced barefoot in the sand. Helen stopped by our table, her headset finally off. "You pulled it off, Mrs. Lee," she said with a grin. "Couldn't have done it without my boss," she winked. "You're not my employee today. You're the reason this place feels alive again." At some point during the evening, a woman approached me, camera in hand. I recognized her from a press event months ago, Melissa Carter from West Coast Living. "Grace," she said, smiling warmly. "I couldn't help noticing how beautiful this setup is. It's not every day you see a wedding this heartfelt and public, considering your last name." I laughed softly. "You've heard the gossip. Everyone's heard the gossip," she said, amused. "But seeing this, I think they had it wrong. Would you mind if I wrote about it? Something simple. A story about choosing your own happiness." I thought for a moment, then nodded. "If it helps someone else believe they can do the same, then yes, write it," she smiled. Snapped a few more photos, and disappeared back into the crowd. As the night went on, I watched Jason dancing with Aunt Lorraine under strings of fairy lights. Helen clinked glasses with a few guests laughing easily. Someone started singing to the strum of an acoustic guitar. The air was warm, the stars just beginning to appear. I took a step back from the crowd, standing at the edge of the surf, my toes sinking into wet sand. The waves rolled in, catching the reflection of lanterns and laughter. I had spent so long thinking that belonging meant earning approval, proving something fitting inside a story I didn't write. But right there under the Hawaiian sky, I realized belonging could simply mean being at peace in your own skin. 2 weeks later, the article appeared. The headline read, "A Modern Wedding Beyond Family Expectations." The photograph beneath it showed Jason and me laughing mid-dance, the ocean behind us. A blur of silver and blue, miles away in Santa Monica. The Heritage Club was mid-meeting when one of the members held up the magazine. "Evelyn," she said, "isn't this your daughter?" My mother froze mid-sentence. Her teacup trembled, spilling amber liquid onto her white gloves. The room fell silent. For once, she didn't have a prepared line. And maybe that was enough. Sometimes silence is the only acknowledgement you ever get, and the only one you really need. The glow from the laptop screen was the only light in my father's study. It was late, maybe past midnight in Santa Monica, and I could imagine him sitting there, in his worn leather chair, sleeves rolled up, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. On the screen, my wedding photo. Jason and I, laughing barefoot on the sand, looked almost unreal, the kind of image people tore out of magazines and pinned to their walls. But for my father, it wasn't the beauty of it that held him still. It was the caption beneath it. Her parents were not in attendance. I didn't know he was looking at it that night, but I felt it later, like some invisible string pulling between us. He called while I was half asleep, the ocean outside our window whispering in steady rhythm. I answered, voice thick with drowsiness. "Dad." There was no reply, just breathing. Then a faint rustle, maybe the sound of paper shifting, or a sigh he tried to swallow. I waited. "Dad, it's okay," I said quietly. "I'm okay." The silence stretched on until I thought the line had gone dead. Then came the soft click of him hanging up. For a moment I stared at the phone, listening to the hum of the ocean again. It wasn't the silence that hurt, it was what it meant, that he had seen me finally, but didn't know what to say. The next morning, while Jason made coffee, I sat on the balcony scrolling through my phone. My name was everywhere. Well, not mine exactly, but the story. The article had been shared dozens of times, each comment a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Beautiful ceremony. She looks radiant, independent and inspiring. I read them all, each one feeling both distant and intimate. Then a message from Dean popped up. "Mom hasn't slept in 2 nights. You did the one thing she's always feared, made people talk about you instead of her." I stared at the words for a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard, before I finally typed back. Maybe it's time she learned that silence isn't the same as dignity. Jason came out, handing me a mug. "You're doing it again," he said softly. "Doing what?" "Reading the comments like they'll give you something you're missing." I smiled faintly. Maybe I just want to understand how she feels. You already do, he said, sitting beside me. She feels replaced. I looked out toward the horizon, where the ocean met the morning light. I didn't mean to replace her. I just couldn't keep being her reflection. Jason set his mug down and pulled me close, his chin resting on my hair. You don't owe her understanding. Just peace. We sat like that for a long while, the breeze lifting strands of my hair. In that stillness, I realized something. The silence between my family and me wasn't empty. It was full of history, of pride, of all the words we'd never said because we were too afraid they'd make the truth permanent. Back in Santa Monica, my mother was sitting in her usual armchair, the same one she used to host guests from the Heritage Club. But this time, the room was quiet. No laughter, no small talk. Just the flicker of sunlight across the floor and the sharp sound of her phone vibrating again and again. She'd read every comment under the article. Beautiful ceremony. Strong woman, Grace Whitmore. Now, Grace Lee. Proves that tradition can evolve. She scrolled until her grip on the phone turned her knuckles white. When my father walked in, she didn't look up. Evelyn, he said gently. You should let it go. She embarrassed us, she said flatly. She embarrassed no one. Evelyn turned her gaze toward the window, her voice clipped and trembling. Our name used to mean something. He hesitated. Maybe it still does. Just something different now. That night she held a family dinner. Dean came quiet as ever, while Dad sat at the end of the table, stirring his wine absently. No one mentioned me, but I hung in the air like a ghost. Halfway through the meal, my father set his fork down. Maybe we were too harsh, he said. Too focused on appearances. Mom didn't look up. She needed to understand her place. And what place is that, he asked. The one that doesn't come before this family. He studied her face for a moment, then said quietly, Maybe that's why she left. Because this family only works if she stays small. She didn't respond. The only sound was the clink of her fork against the porcelain. Meanwhile, back in Hawaii, Jason and I sat on the balcony again, the night air cool against our skin. The sea stretched endlessly below, calm and dark. He traced his finger along the rim of his glass. Do you think they'll ever come around? He asked. I thought for a moment, maybe, but even if they don't, it doesn't matter anymore. Why not? Because silence used to mean they had power. Now it means I do. He smiled, leaning in to kiss my forehead. That's my girl. As I looked out over the ocean, the moonlight glinting across the waves, I felt the strange weight of peace settling in my chest. Sometimes silence isn't agreement. It's exhaustion. It's surrender. But that night I knew the silence finally belonged to me. Robert Ellison's office was the kind of place that smelled like power. Mahogany furniture, old books, and faint cigar smoke. My mother had always liked that smell. It reminded her of boardrooms and closed-door deals, the kind of places where she believed reputations were built. She sat across from Robert now, legs crossed neatly, her voice as steady as ever. I want to know if my daughter has the right to use our family name for commercial purposes, she said. Robert leaned back, glancing over his glasses. Evelyn, are we talking about the article, the one with the photo? Her eyes didn't flinch. Yes, that resort, that company. She's using our name to promote it. The headline mentions Whitmore. I can't allow that. He hesitated. Technically, she's your daughter. She was born with the name. You can't stop her from using it unless it's for something defamatory. It's not about the law, she said, her tone clipped. It's about boundaries. She needs to understand there's a line between personal independence and disrespect. Robert sighed, rubbing his temple. I can draft a letter. A gentle reminder to clarify the name usage. But I'd advise you not to make a spectacle out of it. Send it, she said coldly. I have to show her where the limits are. 2 days later, Helen called me into her office. Her expression was calm but tight. Grace, she said, sliding an envelope across the desk. This came for you from a law firm in Santa Monica. I picked it up. My stomach tightening as I recognized the letterhead. Ellison and Pierce. My father's old friend. Helen watched as I read it. The words blurred for a second. Formal request, unauthorized use of name, potential misrepresentation. I swallowed hard. She actually did it. Helen leaned forward. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'll handle it all right. Don't worry about this. But my hands were shaking. She sent a legal warning to her own daughter over a wedding article. Helen's voice softened. I've seen worse, believe it or not. Still, if you'd like me to contact their office, I will. Before I could answer, Jason appeared in the doorway holding his phone. His eyes flicked to the letter, then to me. You've got to be kidding, he said, his tone sharp. They're still at it. She's still at it, I corrected quietly. He stepped closer, his jaw tightening. Grace, this isn't about reputation. It's about control. She can't stand that you did something without her permission. Helen looked between us. I'll take care of the response. For now, go home, both of you. Try not to let this derail everything you've built. When we got back to our apartment, Jason paced the living room while I sat on the edge of the couch still clutching the letter. You'd think after all that's happened she'd just stop, he muttered. You didn't use the name to sell anything. You didn't do anything wrong. She thinks the name is all she has left, I said. He stopped looking at me. And I stopped needing it the day I changed mine. Later that night, as I stood on the balcony, my phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice spoke low and hesitant. Grace, it's Dad. I didn't say anything at first. I heard about the letter, he said. I'm sorry. I didn't know she was going to take it that far. I already called Robert and told him to pull it back. She won't like that, I said softly. I don't care what she likes, he replied, surprising me. He told me she said she was protecting our family's reputation, but she's not. She's destroying it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was strange hearing my father take my side even quietly. Thank you, I said finally. Grace, he said, his voice heavier. Now you did nothing wrong. I should have said that sooner. When we hung up, I stood there listening to the city's night sounds. Cars passing, waves breaking, distant laughter. It wasn't closure, but it was something. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Melissa Carter. Her tone was curious, almost cautious. Grace, is it true? Your mother sent you a cease and desist letter. I hesitated. You didn't hear that from me. Of course not, she said, but I could hear her typing in the background. I'm writing a follow-up piece, something broader. It's not about you directly, more about what happens when tradition becomes control. I smiled faintly. That's a headline waiting to happen, she laughed. It already is. By the weekend, the article was everywhere. Tradition or control? The cost of legacy in modern families. It featured a photo of my mother from a previous Heritage Club speech mid-sentence, hand raised as if she were addressing an invisible crowd. The piece didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew. Comments poured in, some defending her, most condemning her. Times change. Control isn't tradition. Let your children live. By Saturday evening, #family. Tradition was trending locally. The Heritage Club's board called an emergency meeting. My father didn't tell me what happened in that room. But later, I saw a photo on a local news site, my mother walking out of the clubhouse, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. That night, she returned to her office still in her pale blue suit. The room was empty now, no flowers, no chatter, no assistants waiting with fresh tea. She stood in front of the door staring at the gold nameplate that read Evelyn Whitmore, President. After a long pause, she reached up and removed it, her hands trembling slightly. She set it on the desk, exhaled, and sat down in the dark. If she cried, no one saw. As for me, I didn't feel triumphant, just free. When people lose control, they call it tragedy. But to me, it felt a lot like peace. 3 months later, the Pacific Horizon office was buzzing with champagne and applause. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in gold, the kind of light that made everything look like success. Helen clinked her glass, smiling in that composed, effortless way only she could. To Grace Lee, she said, raising her glass, for proving that leadership doesn't mean playing by anyone else's rulebook. Congratulations on your promotion to regional director. Everyone cheered. My co-workers gathered around, patting my shoulder, offering hugs, their voices blending into the hum of celebration. I smiled, but inside I felt something quieter, relief more than joy. It had been a long year of rebuilding, of letting go of the pieces of me that still reached backward. After the speeches, the music started. Someone turned up a playlist, laughter filled the air, and I excused myself to grab some air. My office was only a few steps away. I closed the door behind me, savoring the silence. I stood by the window, watching the slow sprawl of Los Angeles. Endless highways, glittering glass towers, the Pacific glinting faintly in the distance. It felt far away that wedding day in Honolulu, like it belonged to a different lifetime. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Lee. It was the front desk assistant peeking through the doorway. "There's someone here asking for you. Says her name is Maddie Whitmore." For a moment, I didn't move. The name hit like a half-forgotten melody, familiar, distant, slightly off-key. "Send her up," I said finally. When the elevator doors opened, Maddie stepped out, heels clicking against the polished floor. She wore a white designer dress, sunglasses perched on her head, and carried a bouquet of lilies wrapped in silver paper. Her perfume reached me before her smile did. "Grace," she said softly, almost tender. "It's been too long." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "It has." She sat down, crossing her legs, looking around the office. "Wow, you've done well for yourself. Director, huh? Mom would have loved to brag about that. Well before everything." I didn't take the bait. "Why are you here, Maddie?" She offered the bouquet across the desk. Peace offering, white lilies, symbol of renewal. I stared at them for a beat before taking them. "Thanks." She exhaled dramatically as if releasing tension. "Listen, I know I messed up. I wasn't there for you, and I said some things I shouldn't have, but I've been thinking about us, and about what family really means. Maddie," I said evenly. "You don't have to rehearse this part. Just tell me what you want." She blinked, the mask slipping for a second before she laughed. "You always were the direct one." She opened her designer bag, pulled out a glossy folder, and slid it toward me. "I'm launching my own travel brand, Whitmore Journeys. It's boutique, luxury, influencer-driven, all about creating emotional experiences for women. Pacific Horizon has the infrastructure. I have the platform. We could do something amazing together." I kept my hands folded, unmoving. "You came here to pitch me a business deal." "It's more than that," she said quickly. "It's a chance to fix things between us, to show Mom we can rebuild the Whitmore name the right way." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "You're still chasing her approval." "It's not about her," Maddie said sharply, then softened. "Okay, maybe it is, but you can't tell me part of you doesn't still care." I looked at her. Perfect hair, perfect posture, every word shaped like a plea disguised as strategy. "You're right," I said quietly. "I do care. Just not in the way I used to." Before she could answer, Helen appeared in the doorway, tapping lightly. "Grace, sorry to interrupt. We're wrapping up the celebration downstairs." "Everything okay here?" Maddie turned, instantly polite. "Hi, I'm Maddie, Grace's sister." Helen smiled thinly. "Nice to meet you. Well, I'll leave you both to it." Then, as she passed me, she whispered, "Careful. This isn't the place for personal history." When the door closed, the air between us tightened again. Maddie tilted her head, that small, mocking smile returning. "You think you're better than the rest of us now, don't you? The perfect example of independence?" "No," I said. "Just someone who learned where not to step anymore." She stood, straightening her skirt. "You can pretend all you want, but we both know you wouldn't be here without the Whitmore name. You still need it, just like I do." I rose too slowly. The difference is I stopped worshipping it. For a moment, something raw flickered across her face. Hurt, maybe, or envy. Then she slipped her sunglasses back on. "You've changed," she said. I had to. She started toward the door, heels sharp against the floor. Before leaving, she turned back. "You'll realize one day, Grace, no one makes it alone. Sooner or later, everyone needs family." "Maybe," I said. "But family shouldn't come with conditions." She hesitated, then left without another word. I stood there watching the elevator doors close, the reflection of my own face faint against the glass. The lilies sat on my desk, too white, too artificial. I moved them to the windowsill where the sunlight hit their petals and made them almost translucent. Below me, the city stretched on, endless and shimmering. When people come back into your life, it's rarely because they've grown. Most of the time, it's because they've realized you're worth something to them again. And I'd finally learned how to see that without getting angry. The trade winds had picked up that evening, sweeping through the balcony of our apartment in Honolulu and rattling the wine glasses on the table. The scent of salt and grilled shrimp hung in the air. Jason was leaning back in his chair, laughing about something one of his coworkers had said earlier that day when a knock came at the door. He stood up. "We're not expecting anyone, are we?" I shook my head. The ocean was roaring just beyond the railing, the sound steady and familiar. Jason opened the door, and a postal courier in a blue uniform held out a weathered envelope. "Delivery for Mrs. Grace Lee," he said, checking his tablet for confirmation. Jason took it, thanked him, and shut the door. He looked at the envelope, frowning. "It's from your dad." My chest tightened. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, careful, slightly shaky. I hadn't seen it in years. I took the envelope from him and turned it over in my hands. There was no return address, only the name, from Charles Whitmore. Jason hesitated. You want me to give you a minute? No, I said quietly. Stay. I slid my finger under the seal and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery creased neatly in thirds. The paper smelled faintly of cologne and dust. Grace. I've spent too long letting silence stand where words should have been. I know now that was cowardice, not peace. Your mother always believed control was love. I believed that keeping quiet was respect. We were both wrong. You should know that Helen told me about the ceremony. I helped with some of the arrangements through her quietly. I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy forgiveness, just wanted you to have the start you deserved. You don't have to write back. I just want you to know that I am proud of you. Always have been, even when I didn't say it. Love, Dad. The words blurred a little, the ink bleeding faintly where a drop of moisture had landed. His may be mine. Jason watched me, waiting. What does it say? I passed the letter to him. His eyes scanned it quickly, and when he looked up, his voice was soft. Grace, you should call him. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. No, this is enough. He's reaching out. He's doing what he's always done, saying the right thing too late, but I don't hate him for it. Jason reached across the table, taking my hand. Then what do you feel? I looked out toward the dark horizon, where the ocean met the faint lights of distant boats. I just feel sorry for him, for letting her voice drown out his own for so long. He squeezed my fingers gently. Maybe that's his way of trying to make it right. Maybe I said, but some things you can't fix with an apology. Some things you just learn to carry differently. The wind lifted the letter from the table, slightly rustling it against the plate. I caught it before it blew away. The handwriting shimmered faintly in the low light, fragile and human. Later, after Jason had cleared the dishes and gone inside, I stayed on the balcony staring at the letter again. My father had never been cruel, just absent. Not in body, but in presence. He was always there, but never stood between me and her. Never said stop when she crossed lines that left bruises no one could see. I remembered being 8 years old in the cul-de-sac behind our house in Santa Monica. My bike was pink with white tassels. He held the seat as I wobbled down the driveway shouting, "Don't look back, just pedal." I remember the thrill of speed, the fear of falling, and then the crash when he let go. I'd scraped my knee open, blood trickling down my shin, and I cried. He started toward me, but Mom's voice cut across the yard. "Don't coddle her, Charles. She needs to learn." He froze. I remember the way he looked at me, apologetic, helpless, and then turned away. I cleaned the wound myself. That was the last time I ever asked him for help. Now, decades later, I finally understood. He hadn't been weak out of malice. He had mistaken silence for peace, compliance for love. He believed harmony meant absence of conflict. But harmony built on fear was only quiet, not peace. The sliding door opened behind me, and Jason stepped out with a small wooden box in his hands. "I found this in the closet," he said. "You could keep it in here, somewhere safe." I smiled faintly. "That's the box we used for wedding cards. Seems fitting." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside. The paper made a soft sound against the wood. Jason wrapped his arm around me, both of us looking out at the moonlight shimmering on the waves. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so." I said, "It's strange, but it feels lighter somehow, like something that's been waiting to end finally did." He kissed the top of my head. "You don't have to forgive him today." "I already have," I whispered. "I just haven't told him yet." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of rain. I closed the lid of the box and set it on the table, the wood catching the last flicker of candlelight before the flame went out. I stayed there for a long time after Jason went inside, listening to the ocean and the heartbeat rhythm of the waves. I didn't resent him. Not anymore. I just pitied the man who chose silence for so long that he forgot what his own voice sounded like, and somehow knowing that made it easier to let go. A full year had passed before I heard Maddie's name again. It started with a notification I didn't mean to see. Someone had tagged me in a photo she posted. The image was black and white, dramatic, and posed. She stood by a window in a long satin robe, staring out at nothing. The caption read, "Some stories aren't fairy tales." Within minutes, the comments filled up. "Are you okay?" "Stay strong, Maddie. You deserve better." Then came the whispers, the headlines. Madeline Whitmore and entrepreneur Brian Chase split after 8 months of marriage. The words scrolled across my phone screen as I drank my morning coffee on the lanai, the trade winds lifting strands of my hair. Jason was reading beside me. He glanced up when I sighed. "What is it?" I turned the screen toward him. "Maddie's divorce." He scanned the headline, then leaned back. "Did you see that coming?" "I didn't have to." I said, "She's always been in love with the idea of the story, not the reality." He nodded slowly. "You gonna reach out?" I hesitated. "No. I think she has to hear the silence this time." Somewhere in Santa Monica, I knew my mother would already be on her second cup of coffee scrolling through the same article. And I was right. Later that day, Dean texted Mom, dropped her glass when she saw the news. She called Maddie 5 times, no answer. When I didn't reply right away, he sent another. "I'm done, Grace. I can't live in that house anymore. I'm moving to Oregon. You were right. She only knows how to love herself." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "You deserve peace too, Dean." Then I set the phone down, closed my eyes, and listened to the ocean. That afternoon, Aunt Lorraine arrived from California. Her flight had been delayed, and she looked exhausted, but her smile was the same as always, steady, kind grounding. "Hawaii suits you," she said, hugging me tight. "You look lighter." "I am," I said. "It's hard not to be when you wake up to this every day." She laughed and looked out at the horizon. "I see why you never went back." Jason joined us on the porch with lemonade and 3 glasses. The sun was low, the waves breaking softly below the cliffs. The air smelled of salt and hibiscus. We sat in silence for a while, the 3 of us listening to the rhythmic crash of the ocean. Lorraine finally spoke, her tone thoughtful. "You know, Grace, I used to think family traditions were the glue that held everything together. But maybe they're just chains we call love." I smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe it's about how tightly we let them wrap around us. I learned how to loosen them without cutting them off completely. Lorraine's eyes softened. "That's a hard lesson. Your mother never learned it. She never wanted to." I said, "She thought control was care. I used to think silence was strength. Turns out both were cages." Jason reached over his fingers, brushing mine. "You broke yours," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, I guess I did." The evening light turned golden, spilling across the porch. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, sighing. "You know, your dad called me a few months ago. He said he wished he'd left with you. That caught me off guard. He said that—" She nodded. "He's not the same. Quieter, but remorseful. I think he's finally seeing what Evelyn's perfection cost him." I looked out at the horizon, where the sun was melting into the ocean. He lost more than me. He lost himself trying to please her. Lorraine's voice was gentle. "And what about Maddie?" "She's still learning the difference between attention and love," I said. "I hope she figures it out before she turns into Mom." The conversation faded, replaced by the sound of waves and the distant laughter of tourists walking the beach below. For once, there was no heaviness in the quiet. Just calm. Later that night, after Lorraine had gone to bed, I walked down the path to the beach alone. The moon hung low, painting a silver trail across the water. The sand was cool under my feet. I could still hear the echo of my aunt's words. "Chains we call love." I crouched near the waterline, running my hand through the sand until my fingers found a small seashell, pink and white, perfect in its fragility. I turned it in my palm, the smooth spiral catching the moonlight. "I forgive you," I whispered to no one in particular. To my mother, to Maddie, to the version of myself who kept waiting for their approval. But I'm not coming back. The tide rolled forward, lapping at my feet. I threw the shell into the surf. It disappeared instantly, swallowed by the next wave. The sound that followed wasn't an ending. It was release. The ocean moved like it always had, endless and patient, taking what I no longer needed to carry. And for the first time in my life, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like freedom. The sun came up slow that morning, turning the edges of the ocean pink before the light reached the city. From our balcony, the world looked untouched. Just waves, sky, and the faint glimmer of sailboats drifting near the horizon. Jason was in the kitchen, humming softly as he poured coffee. The smell filled the apartment, warm and steady. I stood by the window, watching the first surfers paddle into the water, their silhouettes small against the rising sun. It was July 26, 3 years since the wedding, a lifetime since the chaos. The air was still except for the soft murmur of the ocean below and the sound of Jason clinking mugs. My phone buzzed on the counter. A single notification. From Maddie Whitmore. I hesitated before opening it. The email was short. Only 2 sentences. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I hope you're happy. No explanations, no excuses. Just that. I stared at it for a moment, the cursor blinking at the end of her words like it was waiting for something more. Then I smiled, pressed delete, and slipped the phone into my pocket. Jason walked over, handing me a mug. You look like you're miles away. Just an old message, I said. Good news or bad? Late news. He chuckled, wrapping an arm around me. That's your family's specialty. We stood there for a while, watching the light climb the walls of our apartment, turning everything soft and gold. The years had made us quieter, steadier. There was no need to prove anything anymore. After breakfast, I slipped on my sandals and walked down to the beach. The sand was cool at first, then warm where the sun had already reached it. I walked until the water lapped at my ankles, each wave pulling away tiny grains of sand between my toes. The ocean has a way of reminding you how small everything really is, how every storm eventually dissolves into the tide. I thought about my mother, then how she must have looked sitting alone in that big house with all her framed memories. I thought about my father, maybe still writing letters he'd never send, and Maddie learning the difference between attention and love the hard way. But mostly, I thought about how far I'd come from the girl who used to measure her worth by their approval. Jason caught up to me a few minutes later, barefoot coffee in hand. He didn't say anything. He just handed me the cup and stood beside me, the two of us facing the horizon. The wind tugged at my hair, carrying the sound of waves and laughter from somewhere down the beach. I felt his hand find mine. You ever think about going back, he asked quietly, to Santa Monica? He nodded. I shook my head. Not really. I don't think there's anything left there that still belongs to me. He smiled. Except your last name. I laughed softly. That one's staying buried. We watched the water shimmer for a while. The sun was higher now, the sky a brilliant, impossible blue. Somewhere behind us, a couple of kids were building a sandcastle, their voices bright and unfiltered. You know, Jason said it's kind of poetic. They built the whole house and you became the foundation they ignored. Maybe I said, but foundations don't need recognition. They just need to hold steady. He squeezed my hand. You've done more than that. I turned to him, smiling. I didn't do it alone. He shrugged. Maybe not, but you were the one who stopped waiting for permission. The wind picked up again, and I tilted my face toward it, eyes closed. There was a time I would have written back to Maddie, something polite, maybe even forgiving, but forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it's enough to just let it sit quietly inside you like a secret peace. We stood there until the tide began to rise, washing over our feet. The water was warm, pulling at the hem of my dress. I could feel the pulse of the earth beneath us, that ancient rhythm that never stopped, no matter what names people gave it. I looked out over the endless horizon and thought about everything that had brought me here. All the noise, the pride, the silence. Some battles don't end when you win. They end when you stop needing to fight. Tradition isn't a chain unless you let it be. It's just a story, and stories can be rewritten. Jason took my hand again, his fingers interlocking with mine. We watched the light shift across the water, quiet and easy. Respect shouldn't be a privilege. It's the bare minimum. The waves rolled in one after another, endless, patient, sure. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need anything else. If you've ever chosen silence over arguing, if you've ever walked away instead of trying to be understood, remember this. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the loudest way to be heard.